Today is Saturday, March 19th. It's been almost a week now since most of us changed our clocks, bringing forward an hour as daylight saving time begins. But why do we change our clocks twice a year, every year? Polls have shown most American adults do not like it. In fact, the Senate just easily passed a bill to stop the practice of changing our clocks once and for all. Though, if it actually becomes law, it would be up to the states whether to stay on standard time or switch to daylight saving time year-round. No matter what happens with it in the near future, today we're sharing a bit about its past. And here's a hint, the history of daylight saving time has nothing to do with farming like you may have heard. It has, however, caused controversy and debate from its first day all the way till now. So here to break it down for us is the man who wrote the book on the topic of time, Dr. Mike OMalley. He's the author of Keeping Watch, A History of American Time, and he teaches history at George Mason University. OMalley has done the research and is here to explain why the very idea of a man-made clock was controversial in the beginning, how it evolved into the practice of changing our clocks twice a year, and some pros and cons of it all. Welcome to the Newsworthy Special Edition Saturday, when we sit down with a different expert or celebrity every Saturday to talk about something in the news. Don't forget to tune in every Monday through Friday for our regular episodes, where we provide all the day's news in 10 minutes. I'm Erica Mandy. It's now time for today's Special Edition Saturday. Hi, Mike. Thanks for joining us here on the Newsworthy.
Thank you very much for having me on.
So before we get into everything about daylight saving time, let's first talk about the history of just using the standardized clock. Not everyone liked that at first, right? So why was it controversial to just use a clock? What did you find in your research about that?
Standard time was first passed by the railroads. They just announced on one day, November 18th, 1883, that they were going to adopt 4 standard time zones. And on that Sunday, that day, they just stopped their trains wherever they were and waited till the clocks were synchronized with the new time. There were no laws passed to implement this. It was just sort of a railroad decree. And a significant number of people objected to that. They objected to the idea that the railroads were now the authority for time. And people would say, well, time belongs to God, or God put the sun in the time, or from time immemorial, farmers have used a sundial, things like that. If you were on the border between two zones, you experienced a pretty sharp difference between local sun time and what the clock said. So the clock would say noon, but it would feel like 11:45 or 11:15 even. And that felt wrong to people, especially in an era when far more people were attuned to the sun to do their daily work.
So why do you think it stuck then?
The railroads were the primary sort of arbiter, not just of timekeeping, but of modernity. They were a symbol of modernity. They were a symbol of industrial progress. And most people were accustomed to kind of running their day by the railroad, whether that was actually getting on a train to commute or listening to train whistles or looking at a clock on a train station. So railroads were right in that, as they thought, people would take their time from the railroads.
Okay, so when and why did daylight saving time become a thing?
It only makes sense if you've already accepted the clock as the authority for time. Daylight saving is the scheme that says, as of such and such a date, we'll move our clocks back in the winter and forward in the summer. The original idea comes from an English builder named William Willett. It's a scheme to, he says, save fuel, but also to provide more hours of recreation. And it's first advanced in the United States around World War I, and it's floated as a scheme for saving fuel for the war effort.
Right. There's a lot of rumors that it's really about farming, but that's not true.
It has nothing whatsoever to do with farming. In fact, farmers, they might be slightly more hostile to it, but the big mover behind daylight saving was A. Lincoln Filene, who ran Filene's department stores. And he had a lobbying group to promote daylight saving because he realized, particularly women, if they got off work and there was still daylight hours, they were more likely to go down to the department store and buy something than if it was getting dark.
And that was influential enough to get people on board, I guess.
Well, and then the hype about the war. I mean, it was pitched over and over as a patriotic measure. The symbol that they used, that Filene's lobbying group used, was a little clock with a doughboy hat, like a World War I soldier. And the clock had a little gun, and the clock was marching around. And it would say, turn your clock back, Uncle Sam, and save daylight for the war effort. And the whole idea was you'd be out gardening, which I think was not true at all. At one point, the president of the Major League Baseball announces that, daylight saving is great. We can start the games later in the day and more people will be able to go. And he's denounced in the newspapers as unpatriotic because the point of this is supposed to be growing vegetables for the war, which, I think the amount of vegetables grown for the war as a result of daylight saving is probably extremely small.
And so once again, this change in the time caused conflict.
It's tried for a year in World War I. And a lot of people love it, but a lot of people really detest it. Like people who have to get up early in the morning because of the nature of their job. Like the AFL-CIO objects to daylight saving. And the reason is, like if you're a miner or some kind of unskilled laborer, you're probably getting up really early in the morning to get to work. And daylight saving means you're always rising in darkness all year round. And then when everybody else is enjoying that alleged extra hour of daylight after work, you're trying to get to sleep. So that was a major objection. Another objection came from people who were midway between two zones because they experienced a radical dislocation from what felt normal. And then finally, some industries objected. Hollywood objected. The movie industry objected very strongly because if people have extra daylight, they'll be out, playing baseball or picnicking or something. They won't be going to movie theaters. So I have a little scrap of film that I found that was from a campaign to convince people not to adopt daylight saving. Maybe the interesting thing about it is that people experience it as kind of a return to nature because you get home from work and there's another extra hour of daylight. So you're going to go outside, but it's actually a symbol of the authority of the clock. And I say this because in the 19th century, it's really common that businesses would just adjust their hours of work to suit the available daylight. And you would typically work shorter hours in the winter and longer hours in the summer. Railroads did that. Steamships did it. All sorts of businesses adjusted their hours seasonally, usually 4 times a year.
Still ahead, our guest gives his opinion about changing our clocks and daylight saving time and whether it's all still relevant in today's world. But first, let's take a quick break to thank our sponsors. This episode is brought to you by Indeed. Well, you already know to come right here to this podcast for the day's news, but do you have a trusted source for your day-to-day hiring needs? It should be Indeed, because Indeed is the hiring partner where you can attract, interview, and hire all in one place. And I know what it's like to have so much going on in a business and just in life that there's no time to waste. So instead of spending hours on multiple job sites hoping to find candidates with the right skills, you need one powerful hiring partner that can help you do it all. Indeed makes it easy to hire great talent. According to ComScore, Indeed is the #1 job site worldwide. So join more than 3 million businesses worldwide that use Indeed to hire great talent fast. Start hiring right now with a $75 sponsored job credit to upgrade your job post at Indeed.com/newsworthy. Offer valid through March 31st. Go to Indeed.com/newsworthy to claim your $75 credit before March 31st. Indeed.com/newsworthy. Terms and conditions apply. Need to hire? You need Indeed. This episode is also brought to you by Masterworks. We all know Oprah Winfrey is a role model, icon, and billionaire media mogul. But our sponsor Masterworks points out she's also an art investor. In 2006, Oprah reportedly purchased a painting by Gustav Klimt at Christie's for an astounding $88 million. Then she resold it for $150 million in 2016. That's a staggering $62 million in profit. She's not necessarily doing it because she's rich. From what I can tell with everything she does, she's a business genius. So why doesn't everyone get involved in the blue chip art market? Of course, most don't have millions to buy paintings outright, like Oprah. But thanks to the company Masterworks, the high-cost barrier has come crumbling down. Now you can invest in masterpieces by Picasso, Warhol, and Banksy without building a media empire first. And yes, they're giving the Newsworthy listeners access. So what are you waiting for? Head to masterworks.art/newsworthy to learn more. That's masterworks.art/newsworthy. See important Regulation A disclosures at masterworks.io/CD. Okay, now back to my conversation with Mike OMalley. A recent poll found that 75% of Americans do not want to change their clocks twice a year, but they are split on whether they'd prefer to stay on standard time or daylight saving time all year. What do you make of that?
I'm an anti-daylight saving crank, but I'm a really early riser too, so it might be that. But I think that we could just change the hours of operation. Like your kid's school, they could just say on such and such a date, show up to school half an hour later. That's not going to kill anybody. And it won't have that weird effect of having people blinking in confusion as they wake up thinking it's 7 a.m., but it's actually 8. And it would actually be much more in tune with what the natural world is doing. There's no reason we couldn't do that. Or we could, in lots of situations, we could make sort of flex hours available. So some people could report earlier and some people could report later. The real hardship, and you know this if you've ever ridden like the DC Metro, if I ride the DC Metro into work early in the morning, all the people are people doing the janitorial work and the maintenance work, people who typically don't live close in, and they have to rise really early. And they're condemned to darkness all year round. And that's a phrase that was used in 1919. They're condemned to darkness by daylight saving. So I'd be in favor of letting businesses change their hours of work to acknowledge how the actual world we live in is changing outside.
Is there an argument that's kind of for daylight saving time in today's world?
When I wrote my book, there was a lobbyist who was working for the extension of daylight saving, and I went and talked to him. And he was sponsored by, it was very clear, like the makers of charcoal briquettes and the makers of mosquito repellent and the makers of softball equipment. These were companies that stood to gain if there was more apparent daylight after work, because people would buy, softball bats and they'd make more money. It was clearly a commercial interest. I don't begrudge them their right to make money, of course, that's completely reasonable. But on the other end, there is somebody who's going to pay a price for that alleged extra hour.
And there are efforts by states to make a change, but Congress so far has not allowed it to go through.
In 1919, there was a federal law. The law made standard time zones legal, and it made daylight saving mandatory for 1 year, and then repealed, and then it was made available by local option. So states could adopt daylight saving or not as they pleased. And then in 1966, it was made federal law. So you have to specifically petition to be exempted from daylight saving. So Arizona refused to accept it. But the story was always that it was drive-in movie theaters who had worked together to prevent daylight saving. Because if there ever was a business that was killed by daylight saving, it was drive-in movie theaters, because you're going to take your kids and the movie won't start till it's too late. So the story is that they organized a campaign against daylight saving, pitching it as government intrusion.
What's your prediction for how this will play out in the coming years? And do you think that we'll face even more time confusion as some states may change in the future, others won't, and now we're all off from each other?
That's a good question, because we really established a remarkable degree of uniformity. It's one of the interesting things that the 19th century accomplishes, because before 1883, every city, every town, every village, every farmhouse kept its own standard of time. And mostly you didn't notice because most people didn't travel or communicate in a way that made it apparent. Now our communication is instantaneous and kind of ubiquitous. So we would see those time differences all the time. I mean, maybe we'll just accept that you'll just negotiate about the time. You'll say, it's going to be 9 o'clock my time, and I don't know what time that is for you, but this is what I'm going to do.
Any final thought for our listeners?
I think daylight saving is an interesting scheme. Maybe its time is up because we're in a more globally synced economy. And so it's more plausible that people would have flexible hours as they're interacting with the other coast, or they're interacting with people internationally. I guess it's possible to imagine if we were running on a more solar or wind or naturally powered world, we might be more open to varying ourselves in response to the natural world rather than pretending that the natural world is what the clock says.
Well, thank you to Professor Mike OMalley for sharing his expertise and perspectives with us today. If you want to read even more about this topic, we've included a link to his book in our episode notes. And of course, we'll be updating you on the developments of the so-called Sunshine Protection Act in our regular daily news updates during the week. Remember, the Senate already unanimously passed the bill, so now it's up to the House. And if the bill has enough support there and from the president, it would take effect in the fall of 2023. So stay tuned. For now, we thank you for making the newsworthy part of your daily routine. We'll be back on Monday with your next 10-minute news roundup. Until then, have a great weekend.